Hey, welcome back to This Week in Creationism. It's episode number 32, recorded on July 26th, 2022. I'm your host, Joel Duff, and here we talk about the world of creationism over this past week. This week, we are going to talk about great ape kinds, 100-million-year-old bacteria that have been revived, gain of function, yes, the 1,000th time that young Earth creationists have tried to or attempted to respond to Richard Lenski's experiments on bacterial evolution. And we'll talk a little bit about young Earth creationist views of climate change. We've got that coming up. And let's get right to it. How many kinds of great apes were there? That question is, that's a really important question for young Earth creationists to answer, because it is a question of what is a kind? Like, how do you define what a created kind is? Remember, young Earth creationists God has created separate kinds of organisms, and each of those kinds of organisms have a certain amount of variation, are allowed to diversify, or we'll say speciate, into different species of kinds. But the central question then becomes, what if you look at an organism out there and you look at another organism? Did God separately create those organisms originally? Do they not share a common ancestor in the past? Or do two separate species that you're looking at share a common ancestor in the past? And so when you look at bonobos, chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans, and you see them, and it's pretty clear that there are significant morphological and behavioral differences between them, and you recognize those differences, you still have to ask yourself the question, do each of those have a separate origin point? In other words, were there no such things of any of those, and then suddenly there were, at some point through special creation, chimpanzees and bonobos and gorillas? Or do all of them share a common ancestor, and God created that common ancestor, that kind of ape, that was then endowed with the capacity to evolve, I'll use the word evolve, into the different forms of apes that we see today? This is just a really essential question for young Earth creationists to answer, because it impacts a number of other things, such as how many animals were on the ark, right? And so Answers in Genesis has their particular answer to this question, and that is that all of the apes, excluding human beings, are all bound by a single common ancestor. So God created one kind of ape, and all the apes that we see today are simply the descendants of those that have diversified into morphologically and behaviorally distinct, separate species. So I was fascinated when I saw this particular question show up on Creation Ministries International's page, because I have discussed this topic multiple times here on this channel and on my blog, especially with respect to Nathaniel Jeanson's views. And I have wondered what Creation Ministries International's position was. So when I saw this title, I thought, aha, maybe I'm going to get my answer. So let's see what their answer is. And the reason they're asking this question is because they were asked this question, right? Not surprisingly, somebody wrote in a question to them about this very thing, that and more. But, and they framed this question as, a friend of mine was making fun of the idea that after the flood, the animals populated the entire earth. In other words, there's a small set of animals on the ark, and they then populated the entire earth within this past 4,000 years. And then the key is, and they also produced new species that fast. So if there was one kind of thing on the ark and just two, like if there were just two great apes on the ark, they had to get off the ark and then become all the different types of great apes that exist today. So not only did they have to get to where they are now, but they also had to change into the forms that they're in a very rapid manner. So he took sharks and apes as an example. He claimed that such complex animals could never produce such different species this fast. And I would make that statement as well, as far as what I know about genetics and biology. I don't know of any mechanism that can create that kind of number of species differences in the short amount of time that Answers in Genesis and others are claiming is all that exists, right? That there's only 4,300 years to do this in, and in reality, much less time than that. So this person asks, my question is, do we know that all the apes are related? Do they share a common ancestor? Or could it be that the ape species we have are actually different created kinds, thus not requiring as much speciation, which seems to be as big of a problem as anything else? And as he said, how could it be that speciation took place so fast? And then, of course, he also wonders about the Australian animals being unique as well, which is another classic question for young Earth creationists. So CMI takes up this particular question. And so here is their answer. They spend most of the response actually addressing this particular question about apes. How many kinds of great apes were there? Some creationists believe that all the great apes represent one created kind. And I just said that Answers in Genesis appears to take this particular position. At least they put it on their displays and show the millions of people that come to see their material. And some believe that there are multiple kinds of great apes. So here we see an acknowledgement that there is disagreement among young Earth creationists about how many great ape kinds there are, which is just an acknowledgement that young Earth creationists don't have an agreed on definition or way of defining what a kind is, since they can't decide whether a gorilla is the same kind as a chimpanzee. Do they share a common ancestor or not? Disagreement. So then they talk about these two different options. And this is where it got very disappointing to me, because when they talk about great apes as one created kind, they just go and point to a paper by Seharty and Gene Leitner, which is a statistical barometrological paper that shows, and their main purpose in that paper is try to show that humans are different than other great apes. And so they talk about how all the great apes kind of cluster together, more similar to each other than to human beings. But even the figure they point to has some big inconsistencies in it, because like the felines don't even cluster together well. They're cluster into two different clusters, and yet they think all the felines are the same kind. So there's a lot of issues with that particular methodology and I'll say the intuitiveness of the answers it gives. So what's their argument for why great apes are the same created kind? Well, maybe there's some statistical parameters that when you put you collect a bunch of data, the great apes are similar to one another. Well, duh. Yeah, of course, the great apes are more similar to each other than they are to other forms of primates and other organisms. So, of course, they're going to cluster together. The question is, what features of that cluster require them to have a common ancestor, versus what they're going to say is in the next section, all right, what about multiple created kinds? Well, if you look at that same figure, that same paper, you'll find that, yes, monkeys and apes come out in two big groups. But then if you start looking at great apes themselves, if you look at the great apes on their own, apart from other creatures, they are likely to split into even smaller clusters. Well, of course, it's like they have similarities. There is a number of characteristics that all the great apes share, like they don't have tails, right? And they have a particular gait. They have a particular hip structure that's a little different than a lot of other primates. So you take those characteristics and say, like, yeah, all the great apes are similar. So maybe they're all the same created kind, right? They share these attributes. So we could cluster them together. However, if we look more closely at a bunch of other characteristics, there's things that the apes don't share, and therefore you could use those characteristics to suggest they're separately created, because they have their own unique features. And so you get down to the point where, well, maybe there could be 4 or 5 different things, right? And then he tosses in here, well, there's been recorded cases of hybridization between chimps and the bonobos, but there hasn't been any hybridization between chimps, orangutans, and gorillas. That would suggest that they're not the same created kind. If they can't hybridize with each other, that's another favorite characteristic to point to in talking about kinds. And then here we get to it. While we're not dogmatic about this, in other words, we're not absolutely certain about this, which is fine. I'm glad they're willing to express that. Most, all question mark of us here. In other words, I'm not even sure if I took a poll of everybody here whether we all have the same view. But my guess is that based on this author, is that CMI, Christian Ministries International, lean toward the view that there are multiple created kinds within the great apes. All right, so we lean against the view of Answers in Genesis to there's multiple different kinds of apes. But on the other hand, they're trying to have their cake and eat it too here. Even if the great apes came from one created kind, I do not see why it would be impossible for them to diversify into what we see today since the time of the flood. Wow. All right. I really thought that they would lean one direction because they thought that Answers in Genesis is pushing too much, that speciation can happen super rapidly. But then they just admit that, oh, yeah, you know what? I don't see why they couldn't have been one kind. They could have just changed into the different types of apes that they have altogether. All right, so I didn't really get an answer. There's no definitive answer. All I learned from this article is that creationists don't have an agreed upon definition of kinds, which I already knew, and that they're really not going to take a strong position on the apes, which I would think is an area that's, if you can't figure out apes, then I'm not sure you can figure out any group. Honestly, you don't have an answer to any group. And I just want to remind you that Answers in Genesis has a display at the Creation Museum in which they show all the great apes having a common ancestor, right? An original created kind that then might have diversified into a variety of different, maybe we'll call them species before the flood, but then only two representatives of that kind survive the flood. And then what they're showing here is they become extinct versions of apes, including Gigantopithecus, giant gorillas, and then orangutans, gorillas, and chimps and bonobos, which are present today. But also they show them evolving into the various Australopithecines, all right, which erroneously they're showing walking on 4 feet rather than standing upright here, but that's a whole nother talk. And so you can see that they're considering just 2 animals becoming the massive amount of diversity present in the great apes, exclusive of the hominids, of course. We'll say modern humans and those related by common ancestry to modern humans, which would be things like the Denisovans and Neanderthals. All right. I think it's just a crazy amount of variation. If you want to go back and watch my video on Y chromosomes and my critique of Nathaniel Jeanson Traced book, I go through a lot of detail about Y chromosomes and the great apes. And there you'll see the tremendous amount of diversity within the Y chromosome, which is highly suggestive of an enormous amount of genetic divergence that has occurred. And I suggested there that this is the reason why young Earth creationists really have to go with a separate creation of each one of these different kinds of apes, because there's just too much diversity for them to be able to handle within their model of genetic diversity. All right, so that's the great apes. Let's stick with Creation Ministries International and look at a paper from July 18th in which they titled it, Dinosaur Age Bacteria Revived from Deep Seabed. All right. Revived from deep seabed. Now, if you just look at this title, what do you think that they're saying? They're saying that there are dinosaur age bacteria, which would be like 65 million years old or older, bacteria. So bacteria that are that old that have been revived, brought back to life from deep sea sediments. So let's see what this is about. All right, so within this particular article, by David Catchpole, I want to read you a little bit here to set up the stage for what I'm going to say next. It is biologically challenging because the cell's complex and fragile machinery. They're talking about the fact that there was these bacteria that are said to have been found in sediments. They drilled a core deep down into the ocean crust, into layers of rock that are of dinosaur age based on conventional dating. And they brought up this rock, and they found cells in those rock. I mean, there was very low number of cells relative to most places on Earth. However, there were cells that were found there. And then when they put them into a more rich media, including oxygen and other nutrients, those cells began to divide and grow, and hence the revival of those cells, right? That they were brought back to life, or they started to grow more actively. And what he's saying is this is biologically challenging because the cell's complexity and fragile machinery. The harsh reality of living things is continually breaking down and decay. Yeah, I mean, everything is in complex organisms, complex biological or chemistry, there is breakdown occurring. And so what are my cells doing right now? They're spending a lot of energy just with upkeep, repairing things. In order to just keep the cell alive, you have to repair. You have to invest a lot of energy just in surviving, not growing and dividing and doing new things. And so without constant repair, the cell's internal workings would simply fall apart. Now, catch this next sentence. Experts say there shouldn't even be any intact DNA after 100,000 years, let alone an entire intact machinery of a living organism. So now if you just read this article, it's like, yeah, I mean, how could a cell be sitting there for 100 million years? Because that's the claim, is that it's a 100 million year old bacteria. There's a 100 million year old bacteria. If it's sitting there 100 million years, and we have this other evidence, and I know which paper, they're not citing it, but they're referencing a particular paper about DNA breakdown and how DNA should, in normal environments, break down into and almost be undetectable after about 100,000 years. In other words, all the major parts, the major chemical bonds will have broken or reconfigured after 100,000 years. So if it's 100 million years, there can't be any DNA left. And if there's no DNA, how's the cell going to grow, right? That's the information for the cell to be able to grow and divide. So it can't be 100 million year old sediments because the cell shouldn't really exist at that point. Now, what's really going on here? Yeah, so I go to and I look at these two references. The first reference, scientists successfully revive 100 million year old microbes from the sea. Microbes had lain dormant at the bottom of the sea since the age of the dinosaurs. Now, this comes from The Guardian, a UK paper, which is pretty well known for, it's going to have clickbait sort of titles. This is a clickbait title. Maybe you're not going to click on it, but somebody will click on that. 100 million year old microbes, all right, laid dormant since the age of the dinosaurs. This very much reflects the title that Creation.com is using, and it also there's also a bunch of quotes in this particular article and summaries from that paper, and everything about in this Guardian paper is what's referred to in this Creation.com paper. And you know that one of my themes is that many creationists don't dig into the original literature very well, and they often rely on secondary materials, all right, popular science articles, and then they interpret these types of papers based on reading other popular papers, which already, I'll say, sometimes misrepresent, most of the time misunderstand, and often oversimplify what they're doing. And so it's kind of like a game of telephone where you've kind of lost the message as you've moved through different sources. And so this title is, I don't like it, right? See, I don't like that particular paper. I'm more interested in the second reference, which they do reference the original article, which is ancient microbial life persists in oxic marine sediments as old as 100 million years, right? Ancient microbial life persists. Right. They don't use the word revived or that it was somehow just laying there dormant for 100 million years and then revived. It's talking about life persisting in those sediments. Let me take you to that article. Aerobic life persists in an oxic marine sediment by Morono and et al. And I think this is from the abstract. We look down at this last sentence here. Our results suggest that microbial communities widely dispersed in organic poor abysmal sediments, abysmal just means sediments deep down in the earth, consist mainly of aerobes that retain their metabolic potential under extreme low energy conditions for up to 101.5 million years. Now, when they mean retain their metabolic potential, meaning we can bring that sediment up, give them nutrients, and they'll begin to grow quite actively. It doesn't mean that they weren't growing at all where they were, but they go on to talk about how they're growing at extremely low rates, or what they're doing is they're going through periods of pauses where they're in essentially a form of dormancy. But it turns out when I read the paper, I found out that not many of them were in spore stage, which means they're in cells that are not in a completely dormant state. Because there are cells that can put themselves into a dormant state in a spore, and those spores can then endure extremely harsh environments, potentially for years or hundreds of years. But millions of years would still be, hundreds of millions of years, I still think would be not the norm or not expected. I certainly wouldn't expect that. But most of the cells were not in spore form, meaning that they're living cells that they captured from these sediments, not cells in complete dormancy. Now, their activity was extremely low because they don't have a whole lot of organics available to them. They don't have a lot of energy available to them. And so their activity is extremely low. Which means they're probably not dividing. Or if they're dividing, they're only dividing once every decade or 100 years. Or maybe there's an influx of a tiny bit amount of energy once in a while, in which case there's a small burst of growth, and then they go back to a sort of resting phase in which all they're doing is maintaining. And so they're not saying, in this paper, they're not saying there's no energy there. They're just saying it's a very, very low energy environment. And if your cells don't do very much, they don't need much energy. Bacteria don't need a lot of energy just to do the stability part, which is do the repair mechanisms they need. Hey, I got problems occurring because of entropy. I need to spend a little bit of energy just to maintain myself and fix things. Right? So later in the paper, we have the same thing, but a little more detail here. The results, the low abundance of spore producers, the rapid initial increases in incubated cell abundance. The reason rapid there is important is because if they were in spore form and you just gave cells the requisite things they need to grow, but you gave them to spores, it would take a while for the spores then to become activated and to begin to grow. But what they saw was immediate growth when they gave materials to these cells. The high percentage of active cells in the incubations and the confining nature of their sedentary habit. The confining nature is this. Above the rock layer that they found above the sediment layer that they found these in, there's a particular rock layer which is impermeable to the flow of nutrients from above, and also would be impermeable to cells actually moving through that barrier. And that's how they know that the cells that are found below this barrier must be from dinosaur age. Right? In other words, these are cells that are descendants. They're not necessarily the exact cells that were, like that particular bacterial cell was alive 100 million years ago, and it stayed the same cell for 100 million years. That cell may have divided hundreds of thousands of times, but it's a descendant of those cells. In other words, this community is the same community of bacteria that persisted from the time of the dinosaurs. We're not, despite these titles of these papers, saying that every one of these cells is the exact same cells that were just trapped there 100 million years ago. And then now all of a sudden, 100 million years later, they're starting to grow. They've existed during that entire time as a community. Collectively, this suggests that microbial communities in oxic subseafloor sediment persist in metabolically active form for at least 100 million years. So they're not saying they're dormant. They're saying they're metabolically active. And so anybody who tells you that, hey, well, like Creation Ministries International, they're suggesting they can't be 100 million years old because their DNA would have decayed by this point. Well, they're implying, or they're misunderstanding, they're suggesting that The cells themselves are 100 million years old. They haven't done anything for 100 million years. They've just been sitting there doing nothing. And then we revive them. If they had just been sitting there expending no energy at all for 100 million years, I agree. Their DNA would have decayed. A bunch of other different proteins in their cells would have decayed and fallen apart, and they would no longer be viable cells. But that's not what the paper is claiming. It's claiming that they live in a low energy environment where they're growing or just subsisting on very low energy levels. And yet low energy levels means, but they're metabolically active, meaning they are doing cellular processes. They are using enough energy to maintain their system. In other words, they're resisting entropy with the energy that they have. And therefore, I have no problem with them surviving as a community over 100 million years. I mean, after all, it's no different than saying that organisms have survived, there are species on Earth that have survived for tens of millions and hundreds of millions of years, right? The descendants, the things alive today are descendants of organisms that lived millions of years ago, right? And right there, so you could say that this species is millions of years old, but it doesn't mean that they were in some kind of hibernation for that whole time. It meant that they were constantly metabolically active during the entire period. That's what this paper is talking about. Metabolically active form for 100 million years. Okay, let's move on. Let's talk about Richard Lenski for the umpteenth time. Actually, I haven't talked about Lenski's experiment very much, but young Earth creationists are a tad bit obsessed with Lenski's experiments. And I understand why. I mean, Lenski's experiment, to simplify it very quickly here, is he took a single bacteria that had grown into a colony, so a set of clones of bacteria, and then made 12 separate colonies from those, right? Took that colony, separated into 12 little pieces, right? If you want to think of it as 12 separate bacteria, but actually they're groups of bacteria, into 12 flasks, and then allowed those bacteria to grow. And then you constantly take samples from those and then start another flask and let them grow, and then take a small sample and let them grow, take a small sample, let them grow. And in those flasks, all 12 of those flasks contain the same amount of glucose, the same amount of citrate, which are both potential energy sources, and then the same environment, meaning the same temperature. They're both shaked at the same rate. They're both moved at the same times in terms of the sample selections from them. In other words, they're grown under identical conditions. And then what Lenski has done is then taken snapshots of those communities through time. The snapshots being, we can actually sequence the code of those colonies through time, and then compare the genomes from the different lineages, the 12 different lineages, to see if they are experiencing the same mutations or different mutations. And then you also watch how they're adapting to their environment, because they're in a different environment than their original ancestor was. And so they are then challenged by the environment, like, hey, you know what, this environment, you could do better living in this environment if you experienced certain changes and became better at doing things like, hey, maybe like using citrate as a energy resource, which the original colony couldn't do. And if you can find a way to do that, Lenski can then find out how they did it, right? Because they have the original code from the original bacteria. And then they can look at the codes from the bacteria that have now shown themselves capable of doing things that their ancestors couldn't do. And then they can look through their history, right? And find out, oh, this is where they made this change, then they made this change, they had this particular mutation. Actually, I shouldn't have said they made this change, right? They had mutations, and natural selection selected those mutations in that new environment to meet that new challenge. Right, so the whole thing is what we call an experimental evolution setup, where you are trying to watch the processes of evolution, mutations, genetic drift, natural selection. All these different things are factors that you then can quantify because you can follow them through time, through many, many generations. And Lenski has discovered and identified a number of different properties and changes that have occurred to these bacteria One of which, the most famous of which, is one lineage of the 12 learned, I put learned in quotes, has learned or mutated, had a mutation that has allowed it to use citrate as a food resource, which has given that particular lineage an advantage in their particular environment to be able to use citrate as a energy source. And this is a nice example of a bacteria that has evolved a new trait, a trait that its ancestor didn't have. So now let's see, how does Answers in Genesis respond to that? Because what we're going to see in this article is Lenski's experiment. What does it tell us about evolution? All right, this article is written by, I have to point out the author, Troy Lacey. Troy Lacey has a degree in natural sciences, a bachelor's degree in natural sciences, and then has done a variety of different kind of communications types jobs, and is now what is called a science writer at Answers in Genesis. But all of this is to say he's certainly no expert in molecular biology and genetics, and has written, and not an expert on Lenski other than having read some of his papers. Mostly what I think this response is he has read the other creation science literature about Lenski and has written sort of a layman sort of response to Lenski based on other creation science material rather than any novel thoughts or discoveries he's made himself by reading Lenski's literature. So the main question he's trying to address is, did a bacterial colony just prove gain-of-function mutations exist? Right? And you've probably all heard that gain-of-function thing because it has become a common, well, let's say a known phrase among the public because of the whole question about gain-of-function research being done potentially on coronavirus or SARS-CoV-2. But gain-of-function just means, or experiments are ones where you're dinking around with the genome in order to try to get the organism to use a piece of its genome in a different way so it gains a new function that it didn't have before. Now, in light of this particular paper, in Lenski's experiment, the question is, did Lenski's colony, that one colony that started out with the inability to use citrate, did its ability to become able to use citrate, is that a gain-of-function mutation? Does that prove that gain-of-function mutations actually happen in nature? All right, because those flasks are nature. I mean, it's a manipulated system, but it's still real living bacteria that have to really do something. And the researchers, right, Lenski and his team, they're not going in and actually like saying, I want to change this base and I want to change this base and I'm going to mutate this thing on purpose, right? They're just letting the bacteria live and do their own divisions and have their own random mutations. And then through that process of dividing and having mutations, all of a sudden, a few of those bacteria suddenly can do something that their ancestors couldn't do. In my mind, in most biologists' minds, that is a gain of function. That is a gain of function mutation. I mean, it couldn't really be more simple. The bacteria couldn't do it, and now it can do it. Therefore, it gained a function. And how did it do it? It's a mutation, and we know exactly what the mutation is because they had the before genome and the after genome, and you can see where the difference is. And so you know just where the mutation happened. So the answer is yes. Now let's see what the twist is, because Answers in Genesis certainly does not want to admit that gain-of-function mutations happen, because that would suggest that organisms could gain new functions, new capacities that might not have been in the original genotype, the original created kind. And if that can happen, then potentially one kind could develop so many new functions that it could become something you might consider a different kind, and that is not allowed, right? You can't make one organism kind into another kind. And gain-of-function mutations would be a very direct route, right, in order to make that happen. So how are they going to weasel out of this one? All right, how are they going to redefine what's happened here to make this palatable to other young Earth creationists? And this article is fascinating in the way that it does it. So let's get right down to the crucial portions of this article. What does the long-term evolution experiment, that's the name of Lenski's long-term experiment, tell us about evolution? Dr. Lenski, and now Dr. Barrick, because Dr. Lenski is retired and he's turned over his colonies to Dr. Barrick, who's moved him to a new institution, and this experiment will continue. And so there are over 75,000 generations of going through these bacterial generations. That experiment demonstrates the most fit, where am I at here? The most of the fitness benefits are due to disruption, degradation, or loss of genetic information. So he's priming the pump here by, he's priming his audience to think a certain way about mutations. He's saying most of the fitness would be like the bacteria got better they got more fit for their environment. In other words, they were better adapted to the particular environment they're living in. And how did they do that? They did it by disruption, degradation, or loss of genetic information. Right? These are keywords they throw out all the time. Oh, you see that gene? That particular gene had a decayed. All right, it had a break in it, and because of that, the bacteria no longer has to use that particular gene. That is not, maybe it's not needing it in this particular. Let me give you a scenario. How might breaking a gene result in better fitness? Let's say you have a gene that is good for making spores. It's a gene that's necessary for making spores in a harsh environment, so the bacteria can survive for a longer period of time. In Lenski's experiment, the bacteria will never need to make spores. So therefore, those genes are not necessary for the organisms for survival. So if one of them breaks, and maybe it was being turned on at a low level, now it's no longer being used. If it's no longer being used, it's no longer using energy, which means the bacteria now has a little bit more energy that it can use for other important processes that it currently faces. That means it'll be more fit in that environment. So in other words, you're losing some of the junk, like the spore forming genes are now junk in a DNA if you're never going to form a spore in a particular environment. And so that's also a loss of genetic information in how Answers in Genesis defines information. So you've lost genetic information, but the loss is a gain with respect to fitness, because you now are able to do something better than you could before, because you're not wasting your time doing something you didn't need to be doing anyway. All right, that's perfectly valid to be able to say this, but the way this is said is that what they're prepping their audience for is anytime you see improvements or anytime you see something good that somebody says is beneficial, it usually has to do with degradation or loss of information. And so it's not really making the organism have more information. It's just rearranging the information and temporarily, and this is going to be the key word, it's temporarily making the organism more fit for its environment, not truly more fit. In fact, these lab-dependent E. coli could not survive outside their specialized environment. That's true, but true in a sense, all right? These E. coli that have been growing in the flask for 75,000 generations have gotten better and better and better and better and better and more fit for growing inside of those tubes in that particular environment. We know that because you can take the descendants and compete them against their ancestors, and they kick their butts. In other words, the descendants of the original bacteria, if you match them up with the original bacteria and you grow them in the same environment, the descendants outcompete them all the time. They're way better at living in that environment. So we'd say they're more fit in that environment than their ancestors are. This is why we'd say they have evolved, because they have changed over time to do that. All right, so if you take that bacteria and you put it outside into another environment, there might be other bacteria that outcompete them in that particular environment, because they're specialized in the environment they're in. They've gotten super good at living in that environment. But the fact is, if you get really good at living in one environment, you're probably getting worse at living in another environment. That's just the way it is. That's a trade-off. And that every single organism on the face of this earth is faced with that same situation, right? If you're adapted to breathing with air, right, you're not going to live very well if you're thrown in water, right? You'll be less fit in water. And the organisms that live in water become very adapted at living in water, and they're not very fit for living on land. Right? That's the most extreme example. But you can get down to very micro level things. Birds that live on the side of a mountain are adapted for living in maybe a particular zone with a certain amount of humidity and a certain food resource. And if they try to fly higher up the mountain, they might encounter other birds that are very similar, but they're adapted for their particular environment, and they're not going to be as fit. Right? So this is it's kind of like, this is just the way all things are. So this isn't some huge point. Oh, if you took their E. coli out and put them in another environment, they wouldn't survive so well. That's true for all organisms, not just lab-grown things. While they may have gained a survival advantage within these unique lab environments, not while they may have, they did gain. I mean, that is shown, right? There's experimental evidence that proves that they gained a survival advantage because they out-survived their descendants. So it's not may have, they did gain a survival advantage within the environment. They're actually less fit overall compared to wild E. coli in any other environment. Okay, they may be less fit than other wild E. coli in other environments. The implication here is that somehow the wild E. coli are so much better. They have more genetic variation. But yeah, they do have more genetic variation. They are probably a little bit more adaptable. And Lenski's experiment actually shows that in other cases. Fitness improvements are not examples of molecular man evolution. This is because fitness improvements are entirely environmentally dependent. Yeah, of course. It's like every single fitness improvement is environmentally dependent. But imagine a species that is living in an environment and it becomes well adapted for that environment, and the environment gradually changes. Right? What's the organism going to do? It can either completely go out of existence, it can go extinct because it can't adapt, or it can change. What Lenski's experiment shows is the bacteria can change into that new environment, right? They adapt to a new environment. In fact, they gain a function that allows them to do something they couldn't do before in order to take advantage of that environment that they weren't in before. And then what happens if that particular organism, the environment has changed a little bit more? It's faced with the same thing, extinction or adaptation. And maybe they gain some additional functions, in which case they adapt to that new environment. All fitness improvements are dependent on the environment because no two organisms live in the exact same environment, right? The environment's there's lots and lots of different environments, and the environment never stays constant, all right, over time. And therefore, all organisms are adapting. And you could say that all organisms are not well fit for other environments. Yeah. The environment today is not the same as even a creationist system. Obviously, the environment today is not the same as it was 4,000 years ago. The environment today is not the same as it was at the original creation. And so organisms have adapted. Now, what he's trying to claim is that this isn't an example of molecules to man evolution. So you're saying like the grand scheme of evolution. It is an example of organisms adapt, and if they can adapt in such ways that they gain new properties, at what point can you say that one species doesn't become another? Well, creationists already admit that species become another species. At what point does a species gain enough characteristics that it becomes something so different than its descendant, than its ancestor, that you would say it's kind of a different kind of organism, right? It has completely new properties that didn't exist in the original ancestor. That would suggest novelty, right? That suggests gain of function. So now we got to go back to this gain of function thing, right? He has to address that. So-called beneficial mutations that lead to adaptation are only beneficial in select environments. Of course, there is no such thing as a beneficial mutation that benefits all species at all times in all environments. Right? There isn't. There is no characteristic which you have or that any organism has that isn't a negative characteristic that would be a bad mutation in a different environment. Right? You can't come up with any mutation or any characteristic that you have and say, like, if I were in this other environment, it's a beneficial mutation. You will be able to find an environment in which that mutation is not good for you. Because it's always dependent on the environment. So the definition of beneficial versus non-beneficial is context dependent, right? It's environmental dependent. Now, I've highlighted the key sentence here. They more properly should be called adaptive mutations, not beneficial mutations. Okay, they're adaptive mutations, which can readily fit within a creation model where these adaptive mutations or mechanisms. Now, what does he call the adaptive mechanisms? Mutations, right? So here's an admission that mutations happen and they can be adaptive in a creation model. After so many years of basically poo-pooing mutations and saying they have no effect, they're only negative, he's admitting that there can be beneficial mutations or adaptive mutations. This is giving it away all completely because all organisms in particular environments have adaptive mutations, and it's what allows organisms to adapt to their environment. And that mutation is a novel new characteristic, right, that allows them to exist in a new environment that they may not have been able to exist in before. All right, so it's mutations, it's selection. There's natural selection going on here. There's horizontal gene transfer. Horizontal gene transfer is where a portion of DNA is transferred from one organism's genome to another organism's genome. And when you do that, you can take the genes from one organism, put them in another organism that didn't even have those genes before, and now they have that new property. They have new characteristics that they didn't have before. Right? So from their perspective, they existed and they were replicating, right, and making new offspring. And then one of their offspring gains a group of genes. I have done a whole video on this showing there's a fungus out there that has gained an entire group of bacterial genes over time and therefore gained an entire metabolic process that none of its ancestors could do before. That is gain of function. Right? That is a very clear case of gain of function. Horizontal gene transfer many times results in gain of function because you're gaining traits as a result. And look what he's doing here. He's saying within a creation model where these adaptive mechanisms, mutation, selection, horizontal gene transfer, epigenetics, which is a short-term adaptive mechanism for organisms, especially long-lived organisms, to temporarily adapt to their environments because it's hard to change your genome very quickly. Founder effect, I don't know exactly how founder effect is it doesn't really cause a direct change in the genome, but it has population genetic effects, and so forth, are a design feature of bacteria that allow them to survive in a fallen world. So now here's the workaround. In order to say this isn't just out and out theistic evolution, these are evolutionary processes. This is how organisms change and adapt in their environment, and admitting that they can gain functions because horizontal gene transfer is a mechanism of gain of function. What is all this? Oh, this is just a design feature of bacteria. They have been built to be able to handle mutations that adapt them to their environment. In other words, give them new characteristics, new alleles. They have been given the ability to transfer DNA from one bacteria to another so they can share characteristics from one to another. In other words, they have been designed to be able to evolve. Right? He's saying bacteria evolve by all the ways that any other evolutionary biologist would say that they evolve. Then there's some stuff about beneficial bacteria, and they're not all bad, and so forth. In God's providence, he provided bacteria with adaptive mechanisms to ensure their survival and often aid in our wellness. Right? But those adaptive mechanisms are natural mechanisms of evolutionary biology. All right. In conclusion, doesn't end there. Where does this leave us in evaluating Dr. Lenski's work as it pertains to a creationist worldview? Dr. Purdom, resident geneticist at Answers in Genesis, states And this is actually a quote from a previous paper of hers from many years before. And this is why I say that Troy Lacey has simply read the other young earth creationist literature at Answers in Genesis and just cobbled together yet another response to Lenski just based on quoting other people and just reiterating previous arguments. And honestly, I think he's gone a little too far. I don't know how much this was edited, but as I point out, his language, he's throwing in there that mutations cause adaptations. And he's throwing in horizontal gene transfer. And he's not directly addressing the whole question at the beginning was, does Lenski's experiment prove gain of function? Well, he actually kind of admits it does provide gain of function without saying it outright. But let's get to this last quote. Adaptive mechanisms of bacteria work by altering currently existing genetic information or functional systems to make the bacteria more suitable for a particular environment. In other words, they have a genome, they can mutate it, they can shift things around to create new combinations, and all of those are just reshaping what they've been given already. So they were created with this set of information, and that they can remix it. And in that remixing, they can actually find new properties because you can have new combinations that didn't exist in the original order of genes. Further understanding of Lenski's research is valuable for development of a creation model of adaptation of bacterial populations in response to the adverse environmental conditions in a post-flood world. In other words, Lenski's experiments show us how bacteria adapt in a world where the world is changing. Yeah, okay. This doesn't address the gain of function thing, except that if you read between the lines, here's what their argument is. They're going to say that gain of function wasn't really, although it's a new function, it was originally there in the design as being able to happen. Because you did have a gene with a promoter and then it got copied, because the way that happened, the way the mutation happened is that bacteria do have the ability, E. coli does have the ability to metabolize citrate under certain conditions, but not the conditions in which Lenski was growing them. And so under that particular environment, it was truly a novel mutation in which that piece of DNA was copied and then it was put in front of a different promoter or a way that the gene is turned on. So the gene was turned on where it had been turned off. That's a mutation. That mutation caused a new phenotype, a new expression of those genes, causing them to be able to bring citrate into the cells and metabolize it, giving those bacteria an advantage that its ancestors didn't have. And what Purdom and others are going to say is, well, the information was already there, and so therefore this isn't really a gain of function. This was just something that God designed to be able to happen. Because he had all the parts there, and all you had to do was have the right mutation at the right place and the right time to make this new combination, which then would allow it to do something and adapt to its environment. Whew. All right. How is that different than what any theistic creationist or theistic evolutionist or evolutionary creationist would say about how organisms have evolved over long periods of time? It's no different. And where are the breaks to this system? Because what if you copied that gene multiple times and then you had more mutations in it that made it be able to metabolize some other substance? In other words, all Purdom is saying here is, if you just gave me a little circle that had like 50 genes on it, and then I just kept duplicating them and I kept mutating them and doing all these things. And eventually I took those 50 genes and I had 5,000 genes. And now I have an organism that's multicellular because now it can do multiple different operations. And I looked at the original cell and I said, I can't do any of those things. Did it evolve? Well, no, not really. It adapted to its environment. And the way it did it was it used its original code. And all it did was it adapted the original code. And so if you have an original set of existing, let's use here, the existing genetic information and functional systems were there, the core parts that make a living cell, as long as you had those, you can like manipulate it through mutations, horizontal gene transfer, natural selection, genetic drift, genetic founder effect, and all these different things. And you can create out of that a far more adapted organism that has tons of new properties and skills that weren't evident in the original tiny little genome. But that still isn't real evolution. You're not really making a new kind out of that because you still started with the existing genetic information that had the capacity to do that. I don't know. Where are you going to stop? That means all you've done, all Georgia Purdom has done, and all Answers in Genesis has left, the only place they have left to argue now is the origin of life. They could say, you can't explain where that original genetic information came from, where the original functional system came from to do transcription and translation, right? To copy or code, the basic operations of a cell. You can't explain that. That's what they would say. However, once you have that, you can make everything else. You can literally make all other living organisms and still claim that that's not evolution because you're working with existing genetic information. All you're doing is adapting it. Like, where does the adaptation end? Right? Where does it end? Once you say that you can have gains of functions and you can have functions that didn't exist in the original genotype, then you're just essentially saying that a single cell could become any organism because it's all based on the original operating system. And it's true. All organisms share one original operating system. It's one of the things that unifies all living things. Let's move on. Not going to go over these articles, but I just want to show you that at ICR, Institute for Creation Research, a couple weeks ago when the James Webb Space Telescope pictures were first going to come out, they and a couple other creationist organizations came out with preemptive articles. It's like about the amazing aspects of the universe, sort of anticipating, there's going to be these new pictures and people are going to be asking the same old questions like distant starlight and all that. And so, of course, they came out with their article and actually this article came out the day after those pictures were published, but they didn't mention the James Webb Space Telescope. They simply republished an article, Seeing Distant Starlight in a Young Universe. In other words, we know people have this question on their mind, so we're going to put up some articles about that. 500 million, what else is here? Stars defy Big Bang. All right, so all of a sudden, all these articles about the world start showing up. Who created the universe? All right, and so forth. And all this is a way to say, like, we know that our audience is going to be asking questions. They'll come here, but they don't directly, some of these sites like ICR never really directly address the new pictures and the new questions. Let's move right back to creation.com. Lots of good stuff from CMI in the last month. This is another story of misinforming the audience, or maybe not understanding the original research again. Ichthyosaur graveyard points to Noah's flood and the Ice Age. All right, so there's an article about this Ichthyosaur graveyard where there's like dozens of ichthyosaurs found in a particular layer of sediment. So Noah's flood not only explains how such fossils formed and how they're so well preserved, it also explains what caused the post-flood Ice Age, which formed the Tyndall Glacier over the fossils. So what was amazing about this fossil find is you have receding glaciers, and that receding glacier then revealed a whole layer of rock because they were just scouring off the rock. And then there's like all these dinosaur bones in it, right at the surface. As the flood came to an end, the oceans would have been warm from geological activity. Then the land would have been cool. And then that would have been the perfect conditions for the Ice Age. So all this ice piled up. And now that it's melted, we can see these things that were laid down just during the flood. Since the end of the Ice Age, the world's glaciers have more or less been equilibrium. All right, I'm mostly interested in the global warming story here than I am in the ichthyosaurs themselves, but I'll address them as well. This phrase, the world's glaciers have been more or less at equilibrium. They advance somewhat during prolonged cold periods, such as the Little Ice Age. They melt back and retreat in warmer periods, such as the medieval warm period. We are currently in a warming trend. And you notice this? All right, and they even highlight this right over here. All right. they're even highlighting this particular sentence, right? This is a not so subtle message to their readers that the whole global warming thing that we hear about, climate change, is a hoax. It's not really something that's any different than anything that's happened in past. We're just in a warming trend right now, right? And how do you know that? Hey, the glaciers, sure, you've heard stories about how the glaciers are retreating, and their article was supposedly about these dinosaurs, but of course the dinosaurs are found because of a retreating glacier, so they couldn't help but throw in here, oh, well, yes, yeah, we admit the glaciers are retreating, but that's only because we're just in this cycle of being warm right now, and eventually those glaciers will come back because they've been going back and forth. I would push back on this and say they have been more or less in equilibrium, and not really been in equilibrium. Right? You have to look at the overall global balance of ice. Yes, there are glaciers that are increasing in size right now, but the majority of them are decreasing in size. And then if you go to the past, yes, there were periods of time where parts of the earth were colder and you might have had advances, but you have to ask on a global level whether that's happening or not. But let's not go too far down that rabbit trail. Well, yeah, let's go down that rabbit trail. I forgot I had these Ken Ham quotes. So Ken Ham has been more and more and more aggressive on this particular topic. I would say that most of the young Earth creationist organizations have kind of had a hands-off approach to the global warming topic. They've sort of like, oh, this is controversial. We just kind of don't talk about it very much. But Ken Ham has just been... he has gone down the full route of, I'll say Fox News in this case, because that's where he gets his information, right? He doesn't understand the basic science, which I think these quotes will very clearly demonstrate. He simply hears what he wants to hear and then repeats it. All right, so here we have, there is not a global a climate crisis or a climate emergency, but there sure is a spiritual crisis. And on the bigger scheme, this is just the way Ken Ham's mind operates, right? Everything is a spiritual crisis. That's the most important thing. And yeah, there are, in some sense, I do agree that the spiritual things of this world are more important. And ultimately, they are the ultimate cause for some other problems that we have. But to treat it as if everything else is unimportant or doesn't even exist, like they're surrogates. Like we have this spiritual issue, but we don't want to face it. So what we do is we make up lots of other issues so we can focus on those, so that we don't focus on our spiritual issue. I don't think that everyone out there who's interested and worried about other issues are doing it solely for the purpose of ignoring their own spiritual issue. So we need to declare a spiritual emergency in this nation. So many of our leaders have rebelled against God's word and so forth on marriage, gender, and pregnancy. All of a sudden, global warming becomes associated with gender. And then what does he link to? A Fox News report. All right, so human life as they want many children as possible in God's image, murder in their middle. So now it's an abortion thing, Noah's flood. Besides, we live in a fallen world, greatly affected by sin. Whoops. So let's look at a few other things. This series of tweets by Ken Ham just encapsulates how he applies his logic to everything. And he has been on a rampage lately, taking anything and everything that's happened in culture and just immediately whittling it down to it all happens because we don't believe in a young earth, right? We live in a fallen world, greatly affected by sin, the curse, and Noah's flood and subsequent ice age. We cannot make climate perfect. There are going to be more hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, fires, and droughts, as there have been in the past. So this reflects that statement from the paper we just saw, right? Hey, there's been floods in the past. There's been tornadoes in the past. Yeah, there's hurricanes now. There's floods now. What are you going to do about it? There's always going to be ones. So why even try to do anything about it? Yes, more people are being affected by such things as they are more people living in places not lived in before. This is a classic argument made on places like Fox News and so forth. oh, the reason it seems like more people are affected by hurricanes and there's more damage is there's more people living in those places, whereas in the past there weren't, right? There's truth in that statement, right? That there's a lot more damage done, but there's a lot of evidence that there actually are more hurricanes and there are more tornadoes, right? The temperatures are different. There is sea level rise occurring, irrespective of its effects on human beings. Right? This is classic sort of, hey, just look over here. Just look at this. That's an excuse. Right? God guarantees man cannot and will not destroy the earth as promised. This goes way back to when I was in college and I was talking to a homeschool group. And this feels like exactly the type of thing I heard from the kids there because they heard it from their parents. Right? God promised he wouldn't destroy the earth again. Right? And it will continue. Right? The sun will rise, the sun will go down, and everything will continue as it is. And so therefore, you don't need to recycle because we can't run out of resources. Right? We don't need to do anything about the climate because the climate can't actually change. There's nothing human beings can do about it. And even if we could do something about it, God will prevent that from happening. Right? Because he's promised the world can't change. Right? So therefore, we're going to be blind to any evidence that it actually does and consider that we might be wrong in that particular interpretation. And what always gets me is the world has dramatically changed. And Ken Ham knows that, right? And he'll even say this at other times, right? So he's inconsistent. The Ice Age, right? You had Noah's flood. God promises all these things after Noah's flood. But then what happens 400 years later? An Ice Age. And that Ice Age covers up like half of North America, right? With a thick layer of ice and completely changes the climate of the entire earth dramatically, right? And that happened after the flood. And so how can you say, even as a creationist, that it's not possible for the climate to dramatically change in the future again? Now he'll go to the card of, but humans can't cause that. That wasn't human caused. Actually, it was in his form of logic, right? Because he's saying that everything that happens in the world is because of man's sin. And so, yes, the Ice Age was man's sin. Why is it that man's sin can't be destroying the environment and causing the climate to change? How can he say that can't be the case, right? Other than this argument that somehow the world was promised to stay the same. He wouldn't destroy the earth again. Destroying the earth with a flood that covered the whole world and reshaped its entire geography. What if all that happened is that the climate warmed and floods came up and covered only 1/3 of the livable space in the world? That would be an absolute disaster in the world, but that wouldn't be God destroying the earth, right? So we would be still very capable of destroying a large portion of ourselves, while God's still fulfilling his promise not to destroy the entire earth. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and this night and day and night shall not cease. Right? What can someone claim that they will lower greenhouse gases by 50% when 95% of the greenhouse gas is water vapor? He is falling for all of the classic arguments that have been made by people against global warming. All right. He has no understanding of the science of this. Climates such as sunspot activity, ocean currents, and so forth, those are really the reasons we see climate change. Right? The sunspot activity thing has been discussed many, many times. And so he easily falls for these really simplistic reactions. And here he just tosses them all in as if like, hey, this is the truth. There's nothing biblical about this, right? He has a Bible verse in here. But in terms of all the other information here, he doesn't have the science, the ability to be able to evaluate these arguments, since he never actually evaluates them, right? He never evaluates actual evidence. He simply has an authority. His authority is Fox News. Right? He likes to say the Bible is his authority, but on most matters, his authority are other human beings, right? Who are saying the things he wants them to say. That's his real authority. Wake up, America. The only solution to man's problems are the truth of God's word and the saving gospel. At the end of the day, I can agree with that statement, but that doesn't mean there aren't temporal things in our world that that God has given us and endowed us with the capacity to understand and given us responsibility to steward this world, right? To care for it. Last item. I talked 2 weeks ago in my sort of big overview about how one of the big things that creationists are still divided about is this idea of feathers on dinosaurs and exactly what a bird is. So here we have, even since I talked, 2 articles. One from Is Genesis History? Is this a feathered dinosaur? We often charge our old Earth colleagues with allowing their biases to cloud the interpretation of the data. But the reality is that all of us have biases that may cloud the proper interpretation of scientific data. As far as Archaeopteryx is concerned, we have often been guided by the extra biblical assumption, meaning we didn't find this in the Bible. We just have this assumption in our minds as creationists that birds can be the only thing with feathers. Exactly, right? Where does it say in the Bible that what defines a bird is that it has a feather? Like that's what it has to have. This has made a mess of the bird dinosaur classification schemes. Yeah, he's absolutely right about that. And this is from the New Creation blog. Just a weird perching bird? All right, I got one thing to show you from this article, but before I do that, let me show you the Creation Ministries International. Not a response to that, but it was almost the same day. While there is nothing necessarily unbiblical about dinosaurs having feathers, the claimed examples have not been convincing. Combined with the fact the idea is that feathered dinosaurs is part of a narrative that dinosaurs evolved into birds, and you can see why we have problems with this idea. This is exactly what Answers in Genesis had a problem with, right? Remember, I talked about that a week ago, where they come in blazing with like, dinosaurs are, it's all because of the narrative that people believe this. And we can't fall into that false narrative. And so somehow, because we can't fall into we can't trust and accept what these evolutionists are saying about the facts of what we see in these bones, we have to like deny that anything that was dinosaur-like had feathers. It makes no sense. That's what New Creation blog is saying. It's like, that's an extra biblical assumption. You made an assumption about birds having feathers, and then all of a sudden you got to deny actual facts in this world. They're staring us in the face. And so this whole article is about feathered dinosaurs, not feathers. Right? They're going to try to find a way to not call those feathers, just so they can continue to say that feathers are associated with true birds and dinosaurs don't have feathers, so they can keep a strong demarcation between dinosaurs and birds. There can't be any overlap there. Otherwise, that gives evolutionists some kind of like a win, right? Because it makes it look like they could have transitioned from one to the other. New Creation blog is completely right on this in terms of actually looking at the evidence and saying, these are the facts, and we have to deal with the facts and find a way to find a better way to understand them within this biblical narrative, or our particular biblical narrative. As mentioned above, so this is straight out of that article from New Creation blog, Archaeopteryx has a blend of reptilian and bird features. The more bird-like characteristics include, they got feathers, they have a brain structure like that, they have an inner ear, they have air sacs, right? Where it's decidedly more reptilian-like characteristics include toothed jaw, long bony tail, all right, belly ribs, clawed forelimbs. Right? It was once thought that Archaeopteryx had the reverse toe that would have allowed it to perch on branches like many birds today. Better preserved specimens revealed that's not the case. In other words, we've actually looked, I know other creationists still point to that and say, oh, see, that was a bird because of that. Now, you add up the characteristics and you say, this is half bird, half reptile. Now, what should the conclusion be? Many creationists are so scared of that, they just want to downplay evidence, they want to ignore evidence, and they want to just deny this, especially the feather part, because that's what everyone understands. They don't necessarily understand gastralia, all right? And so they just don't talk about those characteristics. So is Archaeopteryx just a bird? The problem that comes from Archaeopteryx being just an unusual bird, because that's what you'll hear from Manches in Genesis. Yeah, it's a bird. It's kind of a weird bird. It's got some other interesting characteristics that modern birds don't have, without saying they're reptilian, is that it shares many features with animals that most would regard as not being birds. So this other dinosaur, for example, was a mid-sized featherless theropod, yet it had air sacs like birds do. Right? So there are things that are dinosaur-like, but also have bird-like characteristics, but don't have feathers. That's the opposite problem. Instead of trying to classify every animal with feathers as a bird, we ought to consider how we define the word bird. Yes, that's just obvious. You need to refine what a bird is. And as we saw before, what some creationists will do is they'll just say, look, it's a different kind. It's not a bird. It's not a dinosaur. It's this other thing. Give it another name. It's the Archaeopteryx-like things. How hard is that? You can't say that God didn't just create other kinds that are neither reptilian but neither bird and have characters that are similar in both. I mean, after all, mammals have characteristics that are similar to reptiles, right? But you don't just throw us together with the reptiles. All right, that's it. I'm winding down. And I just have one. I don't have any fun item for this week. Couldn't find anything that was funny. And I wasn't in a very funny mood. So I'll throw you this profound tweet from Ken Ham from July 15th. If you're engaging with someone who is very hostile, remember Christ's command to love our enemies. Completely agree. I just find it a little ironic coming from Ken Ham. Loving your enemies doesn't mean agreeing with them. It doesn't mean saying like, kumbaya, let's get together, have hugs, and I'll accept everything about all your viewpoints. But it does say, I need to treat you as being made in the image of God, and I do need to treat other people with respect who have differing opinions. I don't find Ken Ham to be non-hostile, right? He thinks he is righteously justified in his criticisms. And like I said, he has every right to criticize, find fault, and point out sin. But he needs to find ways to do that show love in a proper biblical sense. And I just find making statements like this just more ironic than they are true coming from Ken Ham. All right, that's it for me this week. We'll be back with episode number 33, and we'll find out what creationists are saying and doing next. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.